The darkness before dawn on June 6, 1944, carried with it the weight of freedom itself. Across the English Channel, 156,000 Allied soldiers prepared for what would become the largest seaborne invasion in human history. The cold Atlantic winds whipped across the decks of over 5,000 ships, each vessel a steel covenant between democracy and tyranny. Lieutenant James Murphy of the 1st Infantry Division pressed his back against the landing craft's steel hull, feeling the vibrations of the engine through his spine. Around him, 29 other soldiers sat in silence, their faces painted with camouflage and determination. The young man from Iowa had joined the Army 3 years earlier, driven by the images of Pearl Harbor that had seared themselves into America's collective consciousness. Now, as Operation Overlord commenced, he clutched his M1 Garand rifle and whispered a prayer his mother had taught him. The surf crashed against Omaha Beach with relentless fury, as if the very ocean sensed the approaching storm of steel and flesh. High above the sandy cliffs, German machine gun nests waited like predatory spiders in their concrete webs. Feldwebel Heinrich cross-peered through his binoculars from his fortified position, watching the dark horizon where enemy ships materialized like ghosts from the pre-dawn mist. The 24-year-old from Bavaria had been defending this stretch of the Atlantic Wall for 8 months, but nothing had prepared him for the armada now approaching his shores. General Dwight David Eisenhower sat in his command trailer at Southwick House, staring at weather reports that had nearly derailed the entire operation. The Supreme Allied Commander had already postponed D-Day once due to storms, and another delay could prove catastrophic. The tides, the moon, and the limited windows for aerial support all demanded action on this specific day. His decision would affect the lives of millions and potentially determine the outcome of the war in Europe. As referenced in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive work D-Day, June 6, 1944, the complexity of coordinating such a massive operation across multiple nations and services represented an unprecedented feat of military planning and international cooperation. The paratroopers of the 82nd and 100th and 1st Airborne Divisions had already begun their descent into occupied France, scattered across the Norman countryside in the pre-dawn hours. Staff Sergeant William Tucker of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment landed hard in a flooded field near St. Mary-Église, his parachute dragging him through knee-deep water before he could cut himself free. The sounds of distant gunfire and exploding ordnance echoed across the hedgerows, punctuated by the distinctive whistle of German artillery shells. Behind the Atlantic Wall, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel slept peacefully in his home in Germany, confident that the weather would prevent any Allied invasion attempt. The Desert Fox had spent months strengthening the coastal defenses, placing millions of mines and constructing formidable obstacles designed to turn the beaches into killing fields. His absence on this crucial morning would prove to be one of many factors that would tilt the balance toward the Allies. The Royal Navy's bombardment ships began their thunderous symphony. At 5:30 in the morning, their massive guns hurling shells the size of automobiles at German defensive positions. HMS Warspite, veteran of both world wars, added her 15-inch guns to the crescendo of destruction that shook the Norman coast. The psychological impact of this naval bombardment was as important as its physical destruction, announcing to friend and foe alike that the long-awaited Second Front had finally arrived. The first landing craft hit Omaha Beach at 6:30 in the morning, disgorging their human cargo into a hellscape of machine gun fire and exploding mortars. Lieutenant Murphy's boat struck a sandbar 50 yards from shore, forcing the men to wade through chest-deep water while German bullets whined overhead. Like deadly hornets, the weight of their equipment dragged several soldiers beneath the waves. Before they could reach the beach, their lives claimed by the very gear meant to protect them. Sergeant John Ellery of the 16th Infantry Regiment crawled across the bloody sand, using the bodies of fallen comrades as cover while he attempted to rally his scattered men. The carefully planned assault had dissolved into chaos within minutes of landing, as prepositioned German defenders poured devastating fire onto the exposed beach. The sound of rifle rounds striking metal helmets created a macabre percussion that mixed with the screams of wounded men and the relentless crash of surf dot above the carnage. German machine gunner Klaus Weber methodically swept his MG-42 across the beach, the weapon's rapid fire earning it the nickname Hitler's buzzsaw. Among the Allied troops, the 19-year-old conscript from Dresden had been drafted only 6 months earlier, but war had aged him beyond his years. Each burst from his weapon sent American soldiers diving for cover, behind the sparse metal obstacles that dotted the killing field at Point du Hoc. The Rangers of the 2nd Ranger Battalion scaled the 90-foot cliffs under intense fire. Their mission to silence the heavy guns that threatened the entire invasion fleet. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder led his men up rope ladders and scaling equipment while German defenders rolled grenades down upon them. The Rangers discovered that the massive coastal guns they had come to destroy were wooden decoys, but their heroic assault had drawn German reserves away from other critical objectives. The medical corps worked frantically to evacuate casualties from the beach, establishing aid stations in whatever shelter they could find. Navy Hospital Corpsman Robert Wright dragged wounded soldiers to safety behind a burning landing craft, applying tourniquets and morphine while enemy fire continued to rake the beach. The red crosses on his helmet and armband made him a target for some German snipers, who ignored the Geneva Convention, but his dedication to saving lives never wavered. British forces at Gold Beach encountered different but equally deadly challenges as they pushed inland toward the village of Romanches. The 3rd Infantry Division faced well-prepared German positions that had been reinforced with additional machine gun nests and anti-tank guns. Captain Peter Young of the Commando Brigade led his men through a maze of barbed wire and minefields, their objective to secure the eastern flank of the invasion zone. Canadian troops stormed ashore at Juno Beach with characteristic determination. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division spearheading the assault against fortified German positions. Major General Rod Keller had trained his men extensively for this moment, and their preparation showed as they quickly established a foothold and began pushing inland. The Canadians would advance farther on D-Day than any other Allied unit, demonstrating the effectiveness of thorough preparation and aggressive leadership. Communication between units remained sporadic throughout the morning, with many radio sets damaged by seawater or enemy fire. Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment famously rallied his pinned-down troops with the words that would echo through military history. 2 kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here. His leadership inspired countless acts of individual heroism as soldiers overcame their fear and began moving forward. The tide of battle began to shift as small groups of soldiers found gaps in the German defenses and started working their way up the bluffs behind Omaha Beach. These unplanned infiltrations succeeded where the original assault plan had failed, demonstrating how adaptability and individual initiative could overcome even the most carefully prepared defensive positions. By 10 o'clock in the morning, small groups of American soldiers had begun to penetrate the German defensive line through sheer determination and sacrifice. Staff Sergeant Philip Strechik of the 2nd Rangers discovered a hidden path up the bluff that bypassed the main German strongpoints, leading a mixed group of Rangers and infantry. He established the first permanent foothold beyond Omaha Beach, providing covering fire for follow-up forces struggling to escape the killing field below. The destroyers of the United States Navy provided crucial support by moving dangerously close to shore, their 5-inch guns targeting specific German positions that had been identified by forward observers. USS McCook and USS Carmack risked running aground to provide accurate fire support, their shells silencing machine gun nests that had been decimating American troops. Throughout the morning, the courage of these naval crews, who exposed their ships to coastal artillery fire, proved instrumental in breaking the German defense. German resistance began to weaken as ammunition supplies dwindled and communication lines were severed by Allied bombardment. Obergefreiter Hans Wegner found himself isolated in his bunker as American troops moved around his position, cutting him off from reinforcement and resupply. The young soldier from Munich had fought bravely throughout the morning, but the reality of his situation became clear as explosions grew closer, and the sound of American voices could be heard. Outside his position, the airborne divisions, despite being scattered across the Norman countryside, began to achieve their objectives through small unit actions and individual heroism. Private John Steele of the 82nd Airborne, who had famously been caught on the church steeple at St. Mary Glees, was eventually freed and rejoined his unit to continue fighting. These paratroopers, operating behind enemy lines, created confusion and disruption that prevented German reserves from reaching the beaches. Brigadier General Norman Coda of the 29th Infantry Division personally led assaults on German positions, his presence on the front lines inspiring soldiers to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The 51-year-old general moved from unit to unit, coordinating attacks and ensuring that momentum was maintained despite heavy casualties. His leadership exemplified the principle that officers must lead from the front. During critical moments, medical personnel continued their life-saving work under fire, establishing more sophisticated aid stations as the beachhead expanded. Lieutenant Frances Slanger, one of the first Army nurses to land in Normandy, worked tirelessly to treat wounded soldiers while shells exploded nearby. Her dedication represented the thousands of medical personnel who served with distinction during the invasion, often at great personal risk. As detailed in historian John Keegan's analysis, 6 armies in Normandy, the success of D-Day depended not just on the famous beach assaults, but on the complex interplay of airborne operations, naval support, and the crucial work of engineers who cleared obstacles and established supply lines under fire. The German response remained hampered by confusion and conflicting orders from higher command. Many local commanders wanted to counterattack immediately, but standing orders required approval from higher headquarters before moving reserves. This delay proved costly as Allied forces consolidated their positions and prepared for the inevitable German counteroffensive. By noon, the character of the battle had fundamentally changed from an amphibious assault to a conventional ground operation. American forces had established multiple exit points from Omaha Beach and were beginning to move inland toward their first-day objectives. The German Atlantic Wall, so formidable in appearance, had been breached through the courage and sacrifice of thousands of individual soldiers. The success at the other landing beaches provided crucial support for the struggling American forces at Omaha. British and Canadian advances threatened to outflank German positions, forcing the defenders to divide their attention and resources. This coordination between different national forces demonstrated the effectiveness of the unified Allied command structure that Eisenhower had worked so hard to establish. The afternoon of June 6 marked the transformation of chaos into momentum, as Allied forces across all 5 landing beaches began to consolidate their hard-won footholds. At Utah Beach, the 4th Infantry Division had achieved most of their D-Day objectives with relatively light casualties thanks to favorable terrain and effective naval gunfire support. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the eldest son of the former president, had personally reconnoitered the beach and made the crucial decision to start the war from right here. When his troops landed in the wrong location, German reinforcements finally began arriving in piecemeal fashion, but their counterattacks lacked coordination and sufficient strength to dislodge the established Allied positions. The 21st Panzer Division launched a determined assault toward the gap between Juno and Sword Beaches, but British anti-tank guns and naval gunfire stopped their advance short of the coastline. Tank Commander Hauptmann Wilhelm von Gottberg led his company of Panzer for tanks in a desperate charge that came within sight of the sea, before being destroyed by concentrated Allied fire. The Royal Air Force and United States Army Air Forces maintained air superiority throughout the day, their fighters and fighter bombers providing close support to ground forces, while preventing German aircraft from interfering with the invasion. Squadron Leader James Johnson of the Royal Canadian Air Force flew for sorties during D-Day, his Spitfire squadron protecting the vulnerable landing craft and troop concentrations from Luftwaffe attacks that never materialized in significant numbers. Communication systems began functioning more effectively as radio operators established relay stations and repair crews restored damaged equipment. This improved coordination allowed artillery forward observers to direct naval gunfire with greater precision, systematically destroying German strongpoints that had survived the initial bombardment. The integration of air, sea, and land forces demonstrated the Allied mastery of combined arms warfare that would characterize their advance across Western Europe. Engineer units worked frantically to clear beach obstacles and establish supply routes, their unglamorous but essential work, enabling the continuous flow of reinforcements and equipment. The 336th Engineer Combat Battalion cleared mines and demolished German obstacles while under fire, their expertise allowing follow-up forces to land with greater safety and efficiency. These specialists, often overlooked in popular accounts of D-Day, provided the foundation upon which the entire invasion succeeded. French resistance fighters, coordinated through the Special Operations Executive and Office of Strategic Services, launched sabotage operations throughout Normandy to disrupt German communications and transportation. Marie-Claire Dupont, a 23-year-old teacher from Caen, guided Allied agents to German installations while risking execution if discovered. The courage of these civilian fighters, who had endured for years of occupation, added another dimension to the Allied assault. The German high command remained paralyzed by indecision and poor communication, with Adolf Hitler still convinced that the Normandy landings were a diversion from the real invasion at Pas-de-Calais. This strategic deception, Operation Fortitude, continued to pay dividends as German reserves remained positioned to defend against a phantom army that existed only in Allied deception plans. By late afternoon, supply ships began unloading directly onto the beaches, bringing the heavy equipment and ammunition necessary to sustain the offensive. The efficiency of these logistics operations, planned in minute detail over many months, ensured that Allied forces would not suffer the ammunition shortages that had plagued earlier amphibious operations in the Mediterranean and Pacific theaters. Individual acts of heroism continued throughout the day as soldiers overcame fear and exhaustion to achieve objectives that had seemed impossible during the morning chaos. Technical Sergeant Frank Pergori of the 116th Infantry Regiment single-handedly assaulted a German machine gun position, using grenades and rifle fire to eliminate an entire squad that had been pinning down his company. Such actions, multiplied across thousands of individual soldiers, transformed tactical disaster into strategic victory. As evening approached on June 6th, the Allied beachheads began to resemble the operational plans that had been developed during months of intensive preparation. The British Second Army under General Sir Miles Dempsey had linked up the three landing beaches and established a continuous front stretching from Ouistreham to Port-en-Bessin. This consolidation provided mutual support between units and created the depth necessary to withstand expected German counterattacks. The American First Army faced a more complex situation, with the Utah Beach forces still separated from Omaha by several miles of German-held territory. Major General J. Lawton Collins, commanding the 7th Corps, pushed his units inland to establish contact with airborne forces while expanding the beachhead perimeter. The link-up between seaborne and airborne forces at St. Miragli symbolized the successful execution of one of the war's most complex military operations. German commanders finally received permission to commit their reserve formations, but daylight attacks proved suicidal against Allied air superiority. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth attempted to advance toward the British sector, but suffered severe casualties from rocket-firing Typhoon aircraft. Oberfuhrer Kurt Meyer, commanding the division's lead regiment, watched helplessly as his tanks were systematically destroyed by Allied fighter bombers operating with impunity overhead. The human cost of D-Day became more apparent as casualty collection points filled with wounded from both sides. American losses at Omaha Beach approached 3,000 killed and wounded, while German casualties remained difficult to calculate due to disrupted communication systems. Field hospitals worked through the night, their surgical teams performing life-saving operations by lantern light while artillery shells exploded in the distance. Intelligence reports revealed the success of Allied deception operations, as German units remained positioned along the Pas-de-Calais expecting the main invasion that would never come. The 15th Army, containing some of Germany's best divisions, waited uselessly while the actual invasion established itself in Normandy. This strategic misdirection, achieved through false radio traffic and dummy installations, multiplied the effectiveness of the Allied assault forces. Logistical achievements during the first day rivaled the tactical success, as Allied forces landed over 130,000 men and thousands of tons of equipment despite fierce resistance. The artificial harbors, known as mulberries, began construction immediately to provide protected anchorage for cargo vessels. These prefabricated ports, towed across the English Channel in sections, represented the engineering ingenuity that made the invasion possible. Local French civilians, after 4 years of German occupation, began to emerge from hiding to assist their liberators. The mayor of St. Marie-du-Mont provided intelligence about German positions to American paratroopers, while farmers guided lost soldiers through the complex hedgerow terrain. This civilian support, despite the risk of brutal German reprisals, demonstrated the widespread desire for liberation among the Norman population, as documented in historian Max Hastings' authoritative account Overlord, D-Day, and the Battle for Normandy. The success of June 6th represented not just military achievement, but the culmination of industrial, technological, and organizational capabilities that the democratic nations had developed. During their struggle against fascism, communication between the beachheads and England improved throughout the day, as submarine cables were laid and radio relay stations established. General Eisenhower received increasingly optimistic reports from his field commanders, confirming that the invasion had achieved its essential objectives. Despite higher-than-expected casualties at Omaha Beach, the Supreme Commander's decision to proceed despite marginal weather conditions had been vindicated by the day's events. Anti-aircraft defenses began operating effectively as Allied units established themselves inland, providing protection for the continuous stream of reinforcements crossing the channel. The integrated air defense system, combining radar detection with automatic weapons and fighter interception, ensured that German air attacks could not disrupt the vital supply lines that sustained the invasion forces. By nightfall on June 6th, over 150,000 Allied soldiers had successfully landed in Nazi-occupied Europe, establishing a foothold that would never be relinquished. The Atlantic Wall, promoted by German propaganda as an impregnable barrier, had been breached in a single day through careful planning, technological superiority, and individual courage. The night of June 6th to 7th brought little rest for the exhausted soldiers on both sides of the Norman battlefield. Allied forces used the darkness to consolidate their positions, establish defensive perimeters, and prepare for the inevitable German counterattacks that dawn would bring. The sound of digging filled the night air as infantry squads carved foxholes from the Norman soil, creating the field fortifications that would protect them from artillery and small arms fire. German forces, finally receiving coherent orders from higher command, prepared for coordinated counteroffensives designed to drive the invaders back into the sea. The strategic reserve that Hitler had withheld during crucial morning hours began moving toward Normandy, but Allied air attacks and French resistance sabotage slowed their advance to a crawl. Train derailments and blown bridges forced German units to approach the battle area by circuitous routes, giving Allied forces precious time to strengthen their positions. The Royal Navy maintained its bombardment throughout the night, their guns providing continuous fire support for ground forces, while interdicting German reinforcement routes. HMS Belfast and HMS Glasgow delivered precise fire missions, directed by naval gunfire liaison officers embedded with forward infantry units. The psychological effect of these massive shells, some weighing over a ton, demoralized German troops, while providing immense comfort to Allied soldiers who could call upon this devastating support. Paratroopers of the 82nd and 100 and 1st Airborne Divisions continued their mission of disrupting German communications and preventing reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Small groups of airborne soldiers, often led by junior officers and non-commissioned officers, seized crossroads and bridges throughout the Cotentin Peninsula. Their scattered deployment, initially seen as a failure of the airborne operation, actually proved advantageous by creating confusion among German commanders about Allied intentions and strength. The first German prisoners began providing intelligence about defensive preparations and troop dispositions, revealing the effectiveness of Allied deception operations. Interrogation reports confirmed that many German units had been caught completely off guard by the invasion, with officers absent on leave and ammunition stored in distant supply depots. This intelligence windfall helped Allied commanders understand the enemy situation and plan subsequent operations. Medical evacuation systems, tested under the most demanding conditions, successfully transported thousands of wounded soldiers back to England for advanced treatment. Hospital ships marked with Red Crosses worked throughout the night, their surgical teams performing complex operations while crossing the storm-tossed English Channel. The survival rate of wounded soldiers during D-Day exceeded all expectations, testament to advances in battlefield medicine and evacuation procedures. French civilians in liberated areas began emerging from their hiding places, offering what assistance they could to their Allied liberators. Village priests provided information about German positions, while farmers shared knowledge of local terrain that proved invaluable for tactical planning. The reception accorded to Allied forces by the Norman population confirmed intelligence estimates about civilian attitudes toward the occupation. Supply ships continued unloading throughout the night despite periodic German artillery fire, their crews working with desperate efficiency to bring ashore the ammunition, fuel, and food necessary to sustain the expanding beachheads. The success of these logistics operations, conducted under enemy fire, ensured that Allied forces would not suffer from the supply shortages that had characterized earlier amphibious operations. Engineering units worked frantically to improve beach exits and establish supply routes capable of handling heavy equipment. The construction of corduroy roads through soft ground and the installation of Bailey bridges over streams and craters allowed tanks and artillery to move inland more rapidly than German planners had anticipated. These infrastructure improvements, largely invisible to combat soldiers, provided the foundation for sustained offensive operations. Radio intercepts revealed growing panic within German command structures. As the scope of the Allied invasion became apparent, messages between German headquarters showed confusion about Allied objectives and disagreement about appropriate responses. The breakdown of German command and control systems, carefully targeted by Allied intelligence operations, multiplied the effectiveness of the physical assault. The dawn of June 7th would bring renewed fighting as both sides committed additional forces to the Norman battlefield. However, the events of D-Day had already determined the ultimate outcome of the European war, establishing an irreversible foothold for Allied forces that would expand inexorably toward the heart of Nazi Germany. The morning of June 7th revealed the true magnitude of what had been accomplished during the previous 24 hours. Across 5 separate beaches, Allied forces had successfully established a continuous front stretching nearly 50 miles along the Norman coast. The sight of Allied soldiers digging defensive positions on European soil marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, though 11 months of brutal fighting still lay ahead. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding all Allied ground forces during the initial phase of the invasion, surveyed the beachheads from his tactical headquarters. Aboard a Royal Navy cruiser, the meticulous British commander had successfully orchestrated the largest amphibious operation in military history, coordinating the efforts of multiple nations and services to achieve strategic surprise and tactical success. His planning, criticized by some as overcautious, had proven exactly appropriate for the unprecedented challenges of the invasion. German high command finally grasped the reality of their situation. As reconnaissance flights revealed the massive Allied armada offshore, and intelligence reports confirmed the scale of the enemy lodgment, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group West, requested permission to withdraw his coastal divisions to more defensible positions inland. But Hitler's insistence on holding every yard of ground doomed these units to destruction. The Führer's interference in tactical decisions continued to handicap German defensive efforts. The human cost of D-Day became more apparent as casualty reports reached headquarters on both sides. Allied losses totaled approximately 10,000 casualties, with the heaviest toll at Omaha Beach, where American forces had faced the strongest German defenses. German casualties proved more difficult to calculate due to disrupted communications, but entire battalions of coastal defenders had been eliminated or captured during the fighting. Individual stories of heroism emerged from the chaos of battle, revealing how ordinary soldiers had risen to extraordinary challenges when their nations needed them most. Private First Class Carlton Barrett of the 118th Infantry Regiment had carried wounded comrades to safety while under fire, earning the Distinguished Service Cross for his selfless courage. Similar acts of valor, performed by thousands of soldiers from many nations, had transformed a desperate gamble into decisive victory. The strategic implications of D-Day extended far beyond the Norman beaches, as the successful invasion fundamentally altered the global balance of power. Soviet forces on the Eastern Front could now count on sustained pressure against Germany's western defenses, preventing the transfer of reserves that might have stopped their advance. The long-promised Second Front had finally become reality, validating Allied strategy and fulfilling commitments made to the Soviet Union. Technology played a crucial role in the invasion's success, from radar systems that guided the fleet across the channel to specialized landing craft designed for beach assault operations. The development of waterproof radios, amphibious tanks, and artificial harbors demonstrated how scientific innovation could provide decisive military advantages. These technological achievements would influence military operations for decades to come. The liberation of Western Europe began with the success of Operation Overlord, as Allied forces prepared to break out from their Norman beachheads and advance toward Germany itself. The invasion had demonstrated that Nazi Germany could no longer defend its conquered territories against determined Allied assault, marking the beginning of the Third Reich's final collapse. French civilians throughout Normandy began to comprehend that their long ordeal under German occupation was finally ending. The sight of Allied tanks rolling through villages that had endured for years of Nazi rule brought tears of joy and hope for the future. Children, who had grown up knowing only war and oppression, could now imagine a world of freedom and democracy. The Success of D-Day validated the Allied strategy of defeating Germany through coordinated pressure from multiple directions while demonstrating the decisive importance of Anglo-American cooperation. The partnership between Britain and the United States, cemented through shared sacrifice on the Norman beaches, would shape the post-war world order and establish the foundation for lasting peace in Western Europe. As the sun set on June 7, 1944, Allied soldiers could look back across the English Channel with pride in their achievement, while focusing forward toward the campaigns that would liberate Europe and end the Nazi regime. D-Day had indeed turned the tide of World War II, beginning the final chapter of humanity's greatest conflict and opening the path toward victory, freedom, and lasting peace.